Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's such a pleasure to see so many students and alumni that I recognize and so many new faces. My name is Azmat Khan. I'm a professor here at the Journalism School and the director of the Simon and June Lee Center for Global Journalism. Tonight's event is both sponsored by the Lee Center, but also by the Overseas Press Club of America, which I know many of you are now members of and will soon be getting great press badges from. And I hope that gives you a lot of confidence covering things on campus. I am so excited about tonight's film for a number of reasons. The first is because it is the first feature film by Aida Alami, who is the James Madison Visiting Professor on First Amendment issues here at the Journalism School. But she's also one of the most gifted journalists I know, someone who covers migration, human rights, religion, and race from North Africa, the Middle East, Europe, the United States, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Senegal. But throughout her coverage, she manages to tell these beautiful and intimate portraits of individual characters, often people who are not understood, often people whose narratives are flattened in existing journalism, and she does it in ways that come alive. I'm particularly excited about this film because of some of the subjects it covers. In March of 2017, Amal Bentounsi came face to face with the French police officer who shot and killed her brother one evening in 2012 in France. France's Children centers on the 5-day trial that followed, as Amal and a network of activists use the courtroom as a platform to spotlight police violence and racism in France. The film also follows a network of other activists who are French citizens and citizens of immigrants whose lives and activism deepen the film's exploration of race, identity, and resistance. There are so many parallels between the civil rights movement and these emerging trends that Aida is really focused on in this film, and the United States' own civil rights movement. You're going to see a really interesting history of groups like the Black Panthers and others that really fit into this. And I'm just so excited for you to both watch this, but also for the conversation that follows. There are so many complex reasons that she made this film, really, and she plans to get very personal in talking to you about it. Both in her making of this, grappling with different issues related to race and identity and religion, and also a little bit more about the process of making a documentary. There are a lot of students here, Aida's former students, who helped make this film, so you're going to hear more about that. So without further ado, let's watch France's Children. Aida, to quote, I think a radio personality in the film. Wow, wow, wow. I can't do it as well as him, but thank you. That was incredibly powerful. Towards the end, we saw a credit in memory of Aida Alami, and I think, the story of you're making this film is rooted in your friendship with her and where you were nearly a decade ago. November 13th, 2015, when those attacks happened in France. Can you just describe a little bit about how you came to, who Layla was and how you came to make this film?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for showing it. Thank you to Satin, who's here, who shot the film. Please, a round of applause for Satin. It's really beautiful. And yeah, so in November 2015, I lived in Paris, right next to where the attacks happened. I reported that night. That same year, there were several terrorist attacks in France. There was a newsroom where many journalists were killed right next to my apartment, and then the concert hall down the avenue from me. So it was a really heavy year. And then January 2016, one of my best friends gets killed also in a terrorist attack, this time in Burkina Faso in Africa. She was on a reporting assignment. And it was this moment where it was either just be really sad and traumatized or do something, and I did what I know is journalism. So I decided to tell the story of the characters in my film because right after terrorist attacks in Paris, and it was very familiar to what we saw in the US after 9/11, where they're looking for scapegoats, and it tends to always be the same kind of people that are targeted in moments like that.
Just to give you some context on Leila, she was a French-Moroccan photographer, and I'm just quoting from her New York Times obituary here, whose hauntingly beautiful photographs explored themes of migration, cultural identity, and displacement. She's described here as one of the most promising photographers of her generation. You were dealing a lot with grief at this time, in both losing one of your closest friends, and there's a line in the film, "Do we have a right to mourn the dead?" In this moment, as you were grappling with the loss of one of your best friends, you know, rising tides of both Islamophobia, but also incredible attacks in a city you knew and loved, what made you decide that this was the story you were going to tell? And what was it like when you met Amal?
Right. You know, on November 13th, before the concert hall attacks, Leila was actually biking that night, and she biked by the concert hall maybe a half an hour before the attack. And she texted after it happened, she's like, "Oh my God, I was just biking by there." And then sadly, 2 months later, she also was killed in an attack. And everything was, you know, it's very strange when you're so used to reporting on terrorism and all of a sudden you become on the receiving end of it. And you start being the one giving interviews and talking about it. It's a very strange moment. Everything was, I mean, I never thought that would happen in my lifetime. And I decided at that point to leave Paris. So I had decided to move back to Morocco. And I think it was the week where I had packed up my apartment. I was kind of done with France. Everyone is telling me about this woman who wants to take down the police institution, basically. And I tried to call her many times. She never picked up the phone. I came to find out that she just has 4 kids, full-time job, and she's trying to take down the police. So that's why she doesn't answer the phone. But it was Ramadan, and she goes, "Listen, I'm going to put my kids to bed. I can maybe meet you at a protest at midnight." I said, "Okay, I'll come." And I walked again, and it's this walk that's very strange for me. It's from my house to this square where there are a lot of protests in Paris. And whenever I walk by, it's by the concert hall, which is still, I can never walk by that place and not think about that tragic night. And as I'm walking, and you know, this avenue has just become the site of so much grief and violence. And I get to the square, and Amal is there. She's talking to a bunch of protesters, and in my head, I'm like, oh, this mother of 4, I just made her drive into the city to see me. But anyway, we sit down, and it was the first time I felt better in months. And I felt so inspired by her. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to make a film about this woman.
I think there's so much to think about in terms of choosing how to tell a story like this, which characters, showing versus telling. There's a very specific approach you took here that gives a lot of dignity, I think, to the characters you focus on, not just Amal, but a lot of these younger activists. And I think it's, especially when you don't know the outcomes of movements, sometimes people can question whether it's worth sort of documenting or preserving that history. What went through your mind in terms of knowing you needed to tell this story, and why, over what's clearly been, this has been nearly a decade in the making?
I think at first I had no idea what I was doing, and I think Satin can testify to that. It was more like, hey, do you want to shoot a film? Sure. But what's the film you want to make? I have no idea. But let me just film these people, and then let's see. I have enough footage to make maybe 10 films. There's a lot. But eventually it was, I have to tell a story. And that's why it took 9 years. It's because I didn't know the story I wanted to tell. I didn't know how to tell it. I had a lot of material. I wanted, you know, and I didn't want to give up on any of the ideas, which is I wanted to show all these things, the connections with the US, I wanted to show the trial. I wanted to show Yasser, who I love. Like, he's one of my favorite interviews in my lifetime is Yasser. I think he's so amazing. The fact that he dresses like a Malcolmite was also part of the story for me. He's the first one I met in the film, was Yasser. So that CNN interview, I watched it live. The one that's in the film where they ask him to apologize. And I remember looking on Twitter and thinking, I want to find this person, who is he? Because as I was watching CNN, the first thing I noticed, of course, the crazy questions they were asking him, but the way he was dressed. I'm like, who's this Muslim kid dressed like a Malcolmite in Paris? Like, I want to know who he is. So I tracked him down, I met him, and I mean, he's wonderful. He's someone I really keep in touch with. And that was my entry point into it. Sorry, I'm going too many directions, because that was 9 years of going into many directions in my head.
How did you develop trust with these characters? Because I know, just as you mentioned, you're watching the CNN interview, people are being dehumanized. They're seen through very particular lenses, and getting the trust of people, I think there's even, sort of moment where Amal is like, she hides from the media, and you're obviously media, so you have time with her. Like, how did you develop that trust with people who I think have been so burnt, and lessons for our students right now who are working in vulnerable communities with people who have often been misrepresented?
Right. I mean, before I did any interview, I just went to every meeting for months. So I would just go and sit down, and this is, I think you see it sometimes, you just couldn't cut it. Like, people say hi to me. It's just, there was no, sometimes I just, we had to keep it in. But I just went and sat down and listened, got to know them. I didn't know at first who would make it into the film. There were many people, wonderful people to choose from, but the idea was just to sit and get them to get used to me and just listen to them and just learn. There was a lot of research. I knew I wasn't I'm not French. I'm not from there, and I don't have their lived experience. So I had to spend time just immersed in their world and get to know them. But also, as you said, there are people who don't trust the media. Like, it's very hard to get a camera in these rooms. To even get everyone to agree to a camera, part of the footage we have, there are some meetings where there were like 50 people. And to get them to agree to have a camera there was kind of tough, and they had to get used to me. And then the crew.
So this film is told through these characters, and it's interspersed with, moments often drawn from French media of conversations that are baffling to watch, really hard to watch. But I think for this audience, can you just sort of describe how representative that is of the conversation around these issues in France? Do they broadly reflect, the conversations, what they sound like, what that sort of other perspective is?
I had so much to choose from, and I decided to choose something that was funny. When he's like, I don't care about skin color, and she looks at him and she's kind of like teasing him. That same filmmaker and writer, Rokhaya, the day of the attacks, she was asked on radio to apologize as a Muslim. And there's an audio of her crying. That was originally in the film, where she's crying. She's like, I can't believe, like, I'm asked. We're all journalists sitting around this table, and I'm singled out by my own colleagues that I see every day. And I could have, it's every day is like that. One of the reasons to go back to this trust with characters that I write about race and Islamophobia a lot in France, and they're aware of my work. I get a lot of backlash in the French context when I write about these things. It's always, oh, she's not from here, she doesn't understand. She imports American ways of understanding France. She doesn't know France, she doesn't understand how French works. And so yeah.
To be clear, you do speak the French language.
Yes.
And there's this incredible sort of colonial history, of Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, these places that also intersect with the history of the civil rights movement here in the US, but also in exile and abroad. Describe a little bit about the history that people of your descent, people who are, of Moroccan origin, or the children of immigrants from Morocco, in France, what some of those commonalities are, and how you walked into this other world, like the history that you show in this film, things that I really was not steeped in, but learned so much from. How much did that play a role in how you wanted to tell this story and the lessons you hope people walk away from it with?
I think one of the things that was really important to me is the fact that these perspectives are not mainstream in France, that there's a resistance to speaking about these things, or to even, there can be so much debate about, should a woman be allowed to work, with her headscarf inside a courtroom, and like they're going to debate about it for 2 hours. It's these things. So me coming from as an outsider, but also as someone from Morocco, which was a French protectorate. Both of my grandfathers were jailed under the French colonial rule, and so you grow up with this idea of you've been, it's not, it wasn't a colony, but it's the equivalent. And then you go to France, and something that I see a lot in France is young men, especially the neighborhood where I live in France is very diverse, and I'm not even exaggerating, there isn't a day where I don't walk to the supermarket and I don't see a 13, 14-year-old getting body searched by a police officer. So I'm very aware of these things, even if I personally don't experience them, because I'm a journalist, which, as you know, and it already puts you in a different category. I don't wear a headscarf. It's easier for me to be in France, but I'm very, very aware of the fact that we're not treated equally by the system.
This film, in many ways, sort of deviates from the type of storytelling you ordinarily do. In written publications, it has more voice. There's a lot of telling in addition to the showing. I remember there's like a card that explicitly says police violence is the quintessential expression of state racism. Can you describe the choices you made in this film in being that explicit, in telling and showing, to be more personal, to not do the kind of pro forma, this person says, that person says, and sort of telling this story through the actors you did and with the voice that you did?
Right. I mean, I have a very strong point of view in the film, as you were able to tell. But the thing is, I've had so many conversations. So I worked in a production house in Paris for years on this film. The editor of the film is Russian, which I thought was great, because as a Russian, she had like no dog in the game. She was just working on the film. It was just from a purely storytelling perspective, didn't care, didn't have any personal history to the story. But we worked with a lot of people in that. It's a really big production house where we would do screenings, and there were a lot of things that people didn't understand necessarily, and I listened. Just because I think, especially if you're in New York, you're very familiar with these conversations. But there were so many times where there were production assistants or my producer's wife or something. They would watch and like, here, I don't get it. And this is why I explain certain things the way I do.
By the way, for those of you who want to ask questions, you can start lining up, and we'll move to you in a minute because I don't want to hog all of your questioning time. But can you describe a little bit more about making this film? Because you did this on it's really impressive to have worked on this over such an extraordinary amount of time, to have done the sort of research and tracking that you did. Tell our students about how you funded this film, about some of the ways in which you learned the skills of documentary filmmaking, and what it took to really bring this to fruition.
So the first time we shot was in September 2016. I think I bought a plane ticket for his side, and he came to Paris, and I filmed a little bit. And then with that footage, I was able to get some money from philanthropists, meaning friends.
Like
who wrote
small
me
philanthropists.
Yeah, exactly. Mega donors, friends, who wrote me checks. And then I had a friend who has a production house in Paris who said, all production costs, my house will and my producer himself has a very interesting story. He's an extremely successful film producer who does these huge, projects, and many times the police stops him and asks him to prove that the car he's driving is his car. So you can imagine then when he saw the film, he's like, yeah, I'm going to try to help you as much as I can. And then I got eventually a grant that allowed me to finish it. But you have to know that everyone who worked on this film took a huge, huge pay cut. And they're the reason the film exists, from the sound mix to the colorist to the editor. Everyone worked for not their real rate.
I mean, and I really think it's worth noting that, you did this as a freelancer. Documentary film often is, a single one can cost, the budgets can be often massive. And to do this with such little, foundational funding, really, I think, speaks to the passion that many of those involved felt for the subject, the dearth of stories of this kind, and is a real, truly a testament. I think I was just chatting with another professor before this, and he was like, Aida also has a film? She does all that and has her own film.
No, I forgot.
Okay. When you think about sort of police violence and, the outcome of this trial, right, which, feels really positive, right, that this person is, this police officer is held to account for the first time. It was unprecedented that nobody had been found guilty in a case like this. And yet there was a lot of backlash to that. What happened as a result of the outcome here?
Right. So, you see some talk about a law that was going to be passed. So that law was passed because of this trial, because they said, oh, we need to create a law so next time a police officer doesn't get convicted. So now police officers in France are allowed to basically by the law to shoot in the back and not get prosecuted for it, which is why the fatalities went up ×5, because it happens more and more. And that's why I use the footage at the end, because essentially that law protects the police officers who killed that 17-year-old.
And they don't track this formally in France. No. You were compiling these statistics, and it says that there's that line card about increased exponentially. It went from what number to 80?
So in 2010 it was 10 per year, and now it's at least 55 per year. Wow. And we see a switch after the law of 2016.
French media, how do they cover these kinds of subjects? And by the way, those of you who want to ask questions, please line up.
So the version of the film you saw is, I think, version 31. So in one of the many versions, I had actually compiled how the media covered this specific trial. And it's like, if you watch the news, you will say, yeah, there was a robber on the run and the police killed him. There was some criminal and the police killed him, and that's pretty much it. And then if you have debates on TV, you're gonna have the police reps. You're not gonna have my characters being invited, on the primetime show to talk about it.
Or they'll be outnumbered, 1 to 10, and told they're racist. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you so much. First of all, for showing this movie. My name is Victor. Greetings from Manuel. I just messaged him, and he's very happy to see his byline there.
Amazing.
My question is not about him, though. It's more relating to your relation to the subjects that you're covering, because so far in classes I've been told how important it is to kind of keep up a certain distance, and obviously I've also been told that it's not always possible to do so, and I'm wondering how much of a consideration that was for you in this project, and if you managed. There was this very intimate scene where you mentioned in the courthouse to her that now you're the one who starts crying, and obviously I could see something like that happen, but yeah, I'm just curious to hear more about that.
Right. I mean, I feel like she's very aware. She was always aware that I was making a film. I don't feel like at any point that boundary was blurred. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think she and I are, like, we're close, but we're not friends in a way, if you know what I mean. Like, she was always aware that she was filmed. I think you see in one scene where she comes out of the courthouse, the first thing she does is walk towards us. Like, she knows she's being interviewed. She knows we're making a film. I think that was very clear. But when you know, I spent maybe 4 years following her around. So, of course, I'm a human being. I'm going to care about her story. I'm going to care about her brother. I still, every time I see the film, and God knows how many times I've seen it, every time I see it, I tear up. Every time I see her, there's something about her pain that's so raw that to this day, I just saw her, she's running for office right now. I was following her around like I always do. And there was a moment where we looked at each other and we started crying. It's like, I can't believe it's been, like, at that point it had been 8 years. I'm like, I can't believe it. And she looked at me, she's like, I'm patient. I said, yeah, you are. So but I feel like I wouldn't have been able to get how sincere she is on camera if I didn't also let my guard down. If I had always been like asking her all these questions, and there were many times where we would just film her and just let her be, and it was part of getting to that point where she was so much herself, and it's really hard to get people to be that. I mean, it's a bit cliche to say this, like, to get people to be relaxed on camera, but it actually is really hard, especially if you're with them in the car, you're with them in meetings. It's also a very high stakes case. She needed that officer for her own peace of mind. She's told me many times that if he doesn't get convicted, she doesn't know what kind of monster she could become. So it was so important for her, but I think at the same time, she doesn't know much about me. Like we it's not like she's my best friend. Like it was always this relationship where I was following her around and filming her.
And you don't feel like a disbalance when you're the one observing so much of her life and witnessing so much and even pointing a camera at it, and then, like you just said, she doesn't know much about your life. Like, I would find that a really tough challenge, not like letting my guard down completely and being like, especially over years, like sharing more about myself as well.
Right. I think I spent so much time hanging around them that they realized that I really wasn't interested, and it kind of happened. And I think it helped that my crew was pretty young, and I think that also happened because they didn't feel intimidated, or we kind of blended in at some point. And I think it shows that they don't notice us anymore.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The film was amazing. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to view it. I have 2 questions. My first question is that a lot of journalists mainstream journalists would maybe ask you this question, why you never spoke to a police officer when you were shooting this documentary. And it seemed like you made this active decision to not, to basically focus on the victims and the family and Amal herself. Today, when people in the journalism school are going to pick up their projects, their master's projects, or the things that they want to focus on in life, I want to ask you, what does journalism mean for you, and why do you do this? Do you think this is something that people should do because of a personal interest? Do you think there's something that is more important to you that you try to highlight through your journalism? And my second question is, why did you choose to call it Francis Children?
Great questions, thank you. So to answer your first question, the police officer was really not the subject of the film, but I felt that having the journalist convey what was happening in the courtroom was a way of giving the side of the police officer. He declined to give an interview anyway. I tried, but it wasn't even an option. But that's why I asked a journalist to every day come and tell us the point of view of the police officer, which I think we kind of include. But also, for me, there's so much, like, if you, in the media, there's so, the point of the police officers is so present that it was important for me to tell the point of view of other people that we hear less. What does journalism mean to me? I'm your journalism teacher, so I should have a good answer. But it's it's really, for me, it's to tell stories and try to tell as much of the story as I can, and also let people tell their stories. I don't think I intervened in that sense. Yes, I have a strong point of view, but I think that the story told itself. And then your second question, why the title? Because two things. There's that speech from the French president in 2005. There were protests in France following the death of two teenagers who were running away from the police and died. And the whole country, not the whole country, but there were huge protests. And that's when the president gave a speech saying, "You are all the daughters and sons of France." So I wanted to answer that speech, but also in the French national anthem, it starts with the, I don't know how the best way to translate it, but children of the nation. So it's a play on the French national anthem, but also this speech by the French president.
Thank you, and we are very lucky to have you as a professor here.
Extra credit.
Hi, Professor Alami. This is Hope from your class.
Aida fan club.
Anyway, so thank you for showing the film. It's really moving. I can kind of see almost a journalism structure in it. I don't know if you're meant to do it or not, but you kind of see the nut graph in the first section where you're doing a lot of like explanation, doing a little bit of explanation, like laying the ground. I think it's like really helpful for us to prepare for the story of Amal's story coming out. I provide a lot of context. So my question is kind of related to that. It's like, I think you make a purposeful choice of including long chunk of dialogue and people just saying what they wanted. Like you kind of, you never did a lot of edit. You just let them say what they want for like a few minutes or so. And this is like a consistent thing with all the activists in the beginning and with Amal, with the journalists. I was wondering if that's like, when is that a purposeful choice, and why do you choose to have like this such like dialogue heavy scene instead of maybe some people doing documentary would try to shoot more like scenes and get archival video, things like that.
Right. Thank you for the question. You're right. You're actually the second person to have noticed that. A friend told me your film is built exactly like you write your stories. So I guess I'm that boring. But that's also a matter of personal taste. I like to watch people talk. I like to not, meddle too much with, even when I watch documentaries, these are some of my favorite documentaries, just when the camera rolls and you don't really over edit what they're doing. But also I think we had such a privilege to be allowed to film in among these people that I wanted to share that privilege that the camera got, to be able to, they just let us film anything we wanted, and that access was so precious. I wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, and thank you for such a beautiful film. I have sort of two questions. One is about the content of the film and the other more journalistic. So right after the verdict, one thing that really struck me is when they came out, they started chanting like, "We don't forgive, we don't forget." And there was like this sense of jubilation. But at the same time, you're celebrating a victory over a murder, a tragic death. And then as Professor Khan brought up, the backlash that happened after. So do you see, like from the content there, do you see that as more almost a Pyrrhic victory? Because they did win that day in court, but I don't know in the long term, they were forced to acknowledge it for one moment, but then how many moments are lost after because of that? And then the second more journalistic question is, how do you find that moment to decide to stop filming? Because this did have a natural crescendo, but for how things developed after, and you were on it for so long, was it just kind of like, okay, we have to stop at some point, or did just the crescendo just feel like this perfect moment to stop?
No, these are great questions. So the first thing that comes to mind is, she's hugging a lot of people at the end, and they're all people who lost their sons to police violence. There's one man who kisses her forehead. His son was burned to death. So it's for me, it was this tribute to these families that through her victory, they got a little bit of recognition that, because this, it's very violent to lose someone in any circumstance. But when it's the people who are supposed to protect you that kill that person, it's very. It took me time to understand that, the kind of pain that someone can feel when it's the state, when it's not a car accident, when it's the person who's supposed to. Not only it's the person who's supposed to protect you, but it's also always the same kind of people who are killed, who are the victims. All look, they all look the same. They all have kind of similar backgrounds. So I think that's why they were celebrating. It was, for once, we were able to be heard and a jury sided with us. Because that's the other thing that I understood through years of research into police violence, is that it's very hard to convince a jury that someone didn't deserve to get killed. Even though, there are a lot of philosophical questions or conversations that you can have about the death penalty, can someone decide to kill someone who doesn't matter who they are or what they did, preceding that interaction with the police officer. So that was one aspect of, and there was a big conversation we had in the edit room where my editor was like, but if we can stop at the verdict and everyone's happy and goodbye, but then you're showing that it continues, so you're letting the police win in the film. And I said, yeah, but that's the reality. I'm not choosing who wins. That's what happens.
All right, thank you again.
Hi, thank you once again for the movie. I guess you sort of answered, but I really wanted you to talk a little bit more about, first of all, a really impressive structure. I really like the fact that you gave that nut graph in the beginning and that context, because I feel like in a lot of cases you see these stories, there's action, stuff that's happening, and then context in the middle of it to explain things, and I feel like the story loses a little bit of its power that way sometimes. And maybe that's why it's your movie is so moving. But I'm wondering, with that ending, you come back all of these years later, you kind of come back, you tie everything into the beginning. Could you talk a little bit more about, that montage? Why'd you decide to build it that way with that protest and everything? And I'm just wondering about that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So a lot of conversations I had. So the film editor that I worked with, the reason I worked with, so I went through 8 editors, and it's the 8th one that was the right one for the film. Many of the conversations we had, and a lot of the thinking we had, was how do we build emotion? And it was more about that actually than how I think journalistically of stories. It was really about emotion, and it was how do we build this emotion? How do we make people care? But also how do we and it's interesting because we tried so many things. Sometimes we would just cut something and it would completely change the way you would feel. For example, the 2 women with the hijab on the street. For me, I don't know, maybe you didn't feel it that way, but I feel like it's a breath of fresh air in the film. You have a lot of heavy conversations, and then you have them, and they're so endearing. But sometimes we would just cut something before, and then it would become this very depressing scene. So we just tried a lot of things, and sometimes you don't have an answer. And the reason our partnership worked so well is that she was very patient, and we would just watch and try things. And I also I would ask people to watch and tell me if they didn't understand. That was a big part of it. I'm very grateful for people and friends who took the time to watch and tell me, this, I really have no idea what this is. this I don't understand. And that helped me. And that's why it took 9 years, because it took me a really long time to build something that I liked.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm a second-year part-timer, and I am of Moroccan background.
Oh.
And this was very fascinating for me because I have family who went through France, but I'm born and raised here in New York. And one of the main themes that I appreciated so much was that you just went right up to discuss the power of the pressure to assimilate. And this idea that, people are not usually allowed to hold multiple identities in one home. And there's something very beautiful and sprawling about this picture, and I think the main question I wanted to ask is what your plans are for the future, because something in it, as I was watching, made me feel like it wants to be even bigger. And I know that's probably a very daunting thing for you after having spent a decade on this film, but it feels like it wants to live as a series or something that really investigates different areas and elements of what it means to be sort of in your homeland, but being considered a foreigner.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I mean, each character of the film could hold an entire film on their own, and these were extremely tough choices to make. But it's true that I've always had in my head, I have all this footage, what should I do with it? So, if someone can do it for me, maybe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just because we're running short on time, we're going to start to wrap things up. But I know that there were students who have worked with you on this, and others. Talk a little bit about some of them briefly.
Yeah, I mean, 80% of the credits are former students. Well, the first one is Sutton was my student in Morocco, not that long ago.
Like more than a decade?
Like more than a decade ago. He shot the film, and then many students helped in post-production who are here tonight. Where are they?
Claudia and others.
Where's Claudia? Hey, thank you, Claudia.
What do you want people to take away from the film?
That if you really like an idea, just do it. Really. People can tell, so many people, like I had so many disheartening meetings about this film. People telling me it's not a thing. It's, when I first tried to get funding, and it was all these, no one cares about this, it's not a thing, you're forcing a relationship with France and the US and so on, and I didn't give up, and you shouldn't either.
I think a lot with my students about the importance of documenting movements that other people may think are not going to win and therefore aren't worth preserving or archiving that history, but about a lot of historians who talk about like the mere preservation, whether the outcome of a movement wins or loses, that the sort of forensic preservation and documentation of the inner workings of that and the thinkings of that actually lives on, sometimes like decades later, sometimes the integration of previous movements that are built upon. And I just wanted to say, thank you for making this historical record. I don't know anyone else who would have, and I think it's a huge feat. So
thank you.
Really
thank
grateful.
you, everyone, for the great question.
Thank you, Aida. Great. Fantastic.